My brother always needed me. He needed my help, and so I've always done my best to be there for him. Unfortunately, my family had trouble helping me, though I guess the problem was that they thought I needed help. When I grew up, I learned that I wasn't the only one in my situation. Many people had come before me into a world that is confused about whether to help them or to hurt them because of who they are. It always tested my faith.
William,
Hello.
hi, how are you?
How are you? Good to see you. We're right?
We're good.
Okay, we've got the thumbs up. We're all ready to go.
And if I refer to you by name, do I say William or Will or what's your...
You can call me whatever you want.
what are you most comfortable with?
Most people call me either Will or William.
Okay.
Can you be gay and Christian?
I think I would have been about 9 or maybe 10, and that was the time when I started to realise my own sexuality, and it of course was a very bad discovery at the time because certainly in those days there wasn't any real support mechanism, and there wasn't a lot of discussion in the media, and that which existed was pretty negative.
I grew up in a quite liberal Christian tradition, and I think, so I didn't ever really hear anything particularly negative about homosexuality in church, and it wasn't talked about one way or another.
I had to work it all out in my own little brain.
Yeah.
Which when you're 10 is only quite little, even though mine was slightly more than most 10-year-olds.
Yeah.
As a young person, I became aware that there were gay people and straight people in the world, and I went to university. There was, feminists and lesbian feminists who were doing things, talking about women's rights.
I was in high school at that time. It was particularly hard for me because I just came in, I was learning how to speak English, transitioning into a new culture. High school was quite fresh for me. Was very dyslexic when I was a kid, couldn't read or write, having to face all sorts of barriers as well as racism, and then having to face my sexuality. My perception about being gay and sexuality was quite negative because of how I was raised and how the Bible was preached to me. I prayed very hard as a child to not be gay.
I was never in your face about my sexuality, but I was not pretending in the sense that if I had a girlfriend who would come to functions to give the illusion that I was straight.
For my own sense of self, I probably had considered myself bisexual from when I was quite young, but I was in a relationship with a man. So I was quite surprised when I fell in love with my partner, Claire, who was also a minister. So so we met through the church. The church is a dating agency.
Wow, this is why I'm single. I need to go to church more.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, the relationship that I try to build with God was because of how people told me that I should do it. That sort of perception was actually quite self-destructive, and it's added more pressure and conflict within myself. I have a very close relationship with God internally and spiritually. I don't necessarily identify myself as a person that belongs to a particular denomination. I rather describe myself as a spiritual person rather than a religious person. Religion has its own conformity, and if you go to every single religion, they all have different separate rules, and sometimes those rules are very contradictory.
At the moment, basically, some of the churches don't know that there are gays out there, and they just have to accept that, but they're not very happy about it. If you don't ever do anything, if you don't ever have a friend or a sexual friend, if you just pretend you are straight, then we'll put up with you.
Yeah.
Well, that is not on,
Yeah.
and it is a formula for very severe mental problems. That cannot be morally right. No. And I think most people in a modern community like Australia now realise this. Unfortunately, a lot of the churches don't.
I didn't really grow up in one particular church. Most of my life, I grew up in Uniting Church, Salvation Army, and other churches. So I never really felt like I belonged to a particular church, but it was very apparent based on the pastors and team leaders and people within that church that they're quite against homosexuality, and many believe that you can't be gay and be a Christian. You have to be either or, you can't be both. That really reinforced that sort of internalized self-conflict that I had, particularly when I was at the high school stage. And it became even more harder after high school when I became very, very depressed to an extent that I just wanted to end everything. Some of my family are open about it when I go to church, and they're quite open about it. Sometimes they even ask me the question, and when they do about my sexuality, I'm quite reluctant and reserved in answering that question.
I think my family had no kind of not a huge sort of issue with gay people, but I think it was still a bit of a shock to find that, for my parents, that their daughter was a lesbian. And so it took them a wee bit of time to get used to it, but they began to love and care for my partner Claire, and she is a truly wonderful person, and so they, I think any difficulty they had was overcome fairly quickly. I felt very sure in my sense that, God loved me, and that Claire and my relationship was a God-blessed relationship, and it was good for us and good for our being ministers. We're both enriched by it.
Well, I've stuck in the church because I remember my time growing up. It was a church that wasn't obsessed about my body parts, wasn't obsessed about where I was putting them. I'm not conscious that my church was antagonistic to gays. I don't think it was ever mentioned. Really? It was certainly not a big deal. My religious upbringing concentrated on what is really important about the Christian religion, which is love, not hate. Yeah. To love one another, to forgive your enemies, to embrace different people of different backgrounds to yourself, and to resist oppression. We have to stand up against tyranny of any kind. We have to stand up against oppression, and this was a wonderful lesson to learn in church.
The thing about the Bible is that you can choose to preach it in a positive way, or you can choose to preach it in a negative way. And I guess some people are driven by their emotions rather than logic, therefore they tend to put in more of their personal beliefs rather than what God really truly is.
If you find a Bible in English that's got the word homosexual in it, it's a bad translation, because there simply was no equivalent word. People think that the Bible is kind of massively full of anti-gay stuff, but
Which
it's
is
not.
not.
No,
True.
They're not about long-term, loving, committed relationships between people of the same sex. They simply don't address that.
It was really at university rather than at school. I learned about the laws that existed based upon views of the Christian doctrine and scripture, mainly Old Testament scripture, that those laws were hostile to gay people. The fact is we exist. So churches and others have got to get real about it and not continue to defy the science. Anything that is based upon mythology and demons rattling around in people's brains is not a good way to go. But facing up to reality and to science and to the truth is the way to build a good and strong and kind society. That message came along at about the time that I learned of the research that had been done by Dr. Alfred Kinsey. I learned as a result of his reports that I was far from alone, that there was a proportion of human beings that were homosexual, same-sex attracted, and therefore that helped me, because in my little brain at that time I worked out that this was just a variation of nature and not allowed to become a big deal. But there were people in society who were trying to make it a big deal, and I knew that they were just a nuisance and they had to be dealt with. But it didn't disturb my inner being, because I knew what Dr. Kinsey was discovering, and I knew science would always trump ignorant beliefs.
Throughout my working life, I've always faced discrimination. Surprisingly, working in retail was one of them. I had people, one of my staff, for example, she's from a particular country, and she made a hand gesture that in her country, people like myself will have their neck cut off for being gay. And I learnt to build myself up from that experience. And in a way, it also helped me understand people in a different way, why they are like that. To have that sort of belief that is so hateful and so negative, to be raised in that sort of way, it's quite sad, and I feel sorry for them rather than I hate them for thinking of me in that way. Someone have raised them to think in that way, in that particular way. Whether it's church or their family or whoever they're constantly exposed to.
I worked for a long time in the Presbyterian Church in New Zealand to try and change the regulations so that gay people would be able to be ministers. Because I came out after I'd been ordained.
Yeah.
They didn't try and get rid of me, but they were making it very difficult for other people to become ministers. So that was a huge amount of struggle and stress, and some of those sort of national church assemblies were pretty awful. And, I heard people say some pretty awful things. But I don't think it ever, I didn't ever feel diminished. There's been some tough stuff, but it's kind of stuff that I've chosen to be part of. Yeah.
My partner, Johan, who had come along by that stage, I met him in 1969. My career was pretty well advanced by the time we put our relationship in Who's Who. And I don't think my sexuality had an unduly negative effect on my career. The fact is that I was appointed to the High Court of Australia and by people who knew about my sexual orientation, and therefore in the end it didn't impinge negatively on me.
I was really shocked when somebody said, but it's an abomination. And, so that was, my first experience of somebody sort of feeling that this was sort of terribly antithetical to being Christian. There are a lot of conservative Christians who think you can't be gay and Christian, and a lot of LGBTI people think, why would you want to be gay and Christian, because you're just asking for trouble. If it's your faith, if it's what you believe and it's how you want to live your life, then I feel really strongly that people shouldn't have to choose between their sexuality and their spirituality. I think that's one of the saddest things that Christian hostility to gay people has caused. This rubbish that people say about hate the sin, and
We love the person, but not.
But
we hate the sin.
I think
It's such an indirect discrimination.
Yeah, well, it's rubbish, and it's not biblical. You can't find a Bible verse that says that.
That's it, exactly.
And I think it really is. It's really damaging, and it's hollow rhetoric that's verging on evil, really. I think because it just does so much damage to people who know in themselves that that their sexuality is part of who they are. It's not a behaviour. It's part of the way we are created. And so
I think that there's been a big change and much more realism, and I think that's been a good thing. I think it's better now because there's so much in media, so much on the internet, so much available, and therefore you realise that you are not alone, and that this is simply a variation of nature and therefore not something to be too worried about.
There's like television shows, media, social media, particularly now with social media, it's much more easier now to find people that you can identify with. Gay people are not straight, they're quite different, but we are our own norm in a way. And what is normal anyway?
being a gay Christian can mean that you don't fit entirely in the church and you don't fit entirely in the queer community too.
The happy community.
So I think it's different experiences of religion too. There's huge diversity within Christianity, but there are accepting Jewish communities and there are accepting Muslim people and Hindus and Buddhists, and within each religion there's a big range of understanding about this. I actually found it was easier to be part of a movement that changed public opinion and laws than it was to change the church. So I put some energy into that.
It's much harder to hate people when you know them, We found this in Australia during the White Australia time, when we wouldn't allow people to come to Australia because of their race. And it was when they started to come and we started to meet them and know them and realise that they were sometimes cleverer than we were and sometimes just as boring as we are. They act in common. It's a symbiotic relationship. The law can stimulate and be stimulated by social change, and just changing the laws doesn't change people's attitudes.
That's true.
But it can contribute to change.
Don't torture yourself from trying to be accepted by someone that doesn't accept you. I think first you need to learn how to accept who you are internally, and whether anybody else accepts you or not, that's their choice, but make your own choice on how you want to accept who you are. Don't change anything about yourself that is good. It is possible to exist as being gay and being Christian at the same time.
I think nothing much is going to change in the Christian church until a lot of people who remain in the church stand up and are honest about their sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is what is going to require of the church, that they come to grips with this reality. If you're putting your head down and hiding yourself and pretending you're something else, then you can't really blame straight people for not knowing the realities of LGBT existence. Stick in there, make a fuss, stand up, express yourself. You can do it respectfully, you can do it kindly, but must be insistent about it. And then the churches will have to come to grips with this reality. We've got to promote and protect and support the good and try to convince those who are not so good to go back to science and learn the science about sexuality, because in the end you can't defy scientific knowledge.
I can think of, within the 10k range of this church, there would be half a dozen other uniting churches where people would be able to sort of be who they are and be open and be accepted, and there are other churches with gay ministers. I just want people to know that if you're gay and Christian, there are choices, there are places you can go where you will be accepted and welcomed, and I just think people should stay away from places that are toxic to their spirits. And I think particularly, I want to get the message out to young people beyond the churches, even that that there really is a variety of views about sexuality within the church, and if your family rejects you because they're a religious family, find a family of friends and connect with other people, because I think that issues around LGBTI youth mental health are still really disturbing.
Quite big.
Yeah. Just be who you are, and find a place where you can be accepted and be welcomed, and get on with your Christian journey. There's so much that we need to be doing. There are so many things that we need to be working on as people of faith, caring for the earth, for the goodness of creation, and as people in Australia, we should be working together to make us a place of welcome, because you are a valuable, loved child of God, and you are called to live that love out in your relationship to God and to others.
From this experience in developing this film, hopefully I can change people's mind that gay Christians are quite real, and we're quite moderate, and we're not evil, and we do not hate God the way many people would preach it. We're actually quite moderate, and we're just like everybody else. We want to be accepted and we want to be loved.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. her name.